The kind lover, also understood as the ethics of the slut. To look upon someone whom is not particularly alluring, or whose allure we may surmise lay somewhere as yet unseen. To transgress one's own loving sensibilities, one's own tastes in the matter. To not be waiting for that teenage feeling, but rather to nonetheless dive in. To seek out the allure of others, and if it is lacking, to make a space for them to be alluring of others, perhaps even if only to oneself as a lover, as their lover, they as one of your lovers. Thus is the transgressive force of love. To look upon the beholden norm and say, sure, but what about them over there too? To hold upon the one deeply still, and yet also reach with some other hand towards another, and another still. To wait upon the tastes of one's heart, but also to taste of the fruits of another. A bit more than thus though, 'tis also the letting of lovers, to be lovers, and lovers to be, as lovers. A kind lover of many loves also has lovers with many lovers. Such is not, indeed, perhaps cannot really be a free-for-all. There is a plausible requirement for structure, for holding on to a lover entails some structure to the holding of hands. One cannot be structureless in form. The kind lover mayhaps best understand their own sexual selves as gifts to be fairly freely given. A kind of light-hearted view of it all, that glances upon sexuality as a good, at the very least not a bad, until proven otherwise. Whilst the sex negativist looks upon loves and sexualities as something in need of justification that it be good, and hence consistently nips away at it as if it were a bad with a kernel of good somewhere perhaps within it, or perhaps somewhere within the context of culture. The kind lover, the good slut, the ethical lover, takes for granted their own bodies as a beautiful sort of gift to be given away rather freely so, that others may partake of it for their own pleasure, and thereby too those others giving of their bodies freely towards the pleasure of others. Such sex-positivist views upon the situation entails that sex is a good, at least not a bad, and reaches out to find the limits of that good. To whence, where, and why for might this otherwise good and beautiful thing become a bad? Hence it does not nip away at love, it does not criticize love and sex, at least, not as a matter of course. It requires proof of a bad before it levels such criticisms, and perhaps it seeks out such proofs with its reaching hands of sex and love. Such a kind lover reaches out towards others in a rather brave manner, a manner of courage, the manner of courage. It attempts to include as much as it can, and really only desires to not include those that might not include. Such kind lovers do have their limits. They are simply not things predetermined, certainly not of themselves so predetermined. The somewhat bland but important recognition that the various aesthetical considerations, previously alluded to as power imbalances, are merely cultural norms. Such a change in dispositions regarding the nature and functional reality of these things is fairly crucial. What others might behold as problems of power and the imbalances thereof, we may rather muse them into being considerations of aesthetical import. Important things indeed. Beautiful things themselves, but then, there is after all a variety of them. The danger and the big bad being to mistake those as something of dreadfully serious importance. Folks accustomed to thinking of these things as power imbalances would do better to reconsider them as aesthetics of a most concerning concern. whose bads have far more to do with how seriously and with how much levity they are taken. How kindly one is disposed towards those other aesthetical modes. How broadly one might develop their tastes. The kind lover too does have other kinds of concerns. This paints perhaps too frivolous a picture, though sex and love at their delights may be exactly quite frivolous. Other concerns that arise, that accrue, may do so indeed through the steadfastness of hand-holding. The relationships that endure presents themselves as their own sorts of presence, their precedents of presence being their presently present. Their gifts. There are, in other words, aspects of relationships that accrue themselves, that manifest themselves through time, rather than the immediacy of the bump and grind, though the accrual of the bump and grind thereof is far from cruel. The point, the thrust of such kind lovers being thus, our hearts may beat fierce and free, but they do still long for longer lovers than the whom holds hands, merely insofar as their whims may take them. The lovers whom hold of themselves, their self, and view love as firstly thereof, they the ones whom mask love's many musings as being indicative of but one love, one grace, one aesthetic of tastes. Such flighty ones they are. These are pretty words, and their prettiness is the point. Still, I want to try and give something a bit more concrete on the accounting, something a bit uglier in the truth-telling of it. The pragmatics of this amount to, in the current, for instance, the concerns that a boss may sleep with a subordinate. I assure you, there is nothing at all wrong with that relationship. There is something wrong with the circumstances that relationship is found within. But here, let's give it its due course of consideration. The boss has the powers of hiring, firing, of promotion, of rewards from the work, of lightening the load, of making the load heavier. So much of life in the currents revolves around these kinds of situations. To find oneself, a mere lowly employee in the hands of someone who has that much power over them, the capacity to grant boons and bust upon, for merely a butt to bust a nut upon, is a rather striking temptation, allure, and concern. Who, we may wonder, is alluring whom? The neoclassical concern on this is that the employee, so lowly a creature as they are, is practically helpless in that situation, sans any kind of legal protection that is. The boss could make the advance, and put a little gentle pin in that cause it's got some importance to the point, and the employee is left with a dilemma, very real one I assure you. To refuse is to be subjected to the whims of the advancer, the boss, who does indeed have power to abuse. Granted that it is the abuse of power that is the problem, to head off your coming comment, nonetheless the decision to say yes or no remains the pragmatic concern. Absent any laws to protect against that kind of abuse, absent any sorts of protections, guardrails, etc., the boss can freely abuse. Which is the problem of the point. The coercion there can be rather intense. And this seems to be the main aspect of the concern. Does that coercion amount to a thereby lacking of consent? This is somewhat interesting tbh, even when I come at it from a perspective that is skeptical of the claim.
If you're mean to someone,
it is interesting in no small part
you.
because I am
example,
uncertain as to if consent or
the
the lack thereof is the problem.
Bad things about
Is it the abuse of power, in other words, that is the problem, and not a lacking of consent? Among my most serious concerns in retort to the point is doesn't that poor lowly employee also risk benefits? Do they not also play the game very oft? Are they not also actual agents of free will, agency having beings? To which I am highly inclined to say yes, they are. And hence they may actually be giving consent, and the issue isn't the coercion. To be clear, the situation is so obviously one whereby the lowly employee may in fact be a willing participant, even if there are instances whereby they are not, and we would still say those instances are likely bad. That might it really be the case that what is bad about the situation isn't coercion? It isn't lack of consent. Rather, there is just something else going on that does in fact raise our spidey sense as there being an ethical bad. I strongly suggest that consent culture crowd seriously reconsider placing all their sexual ethical concerns in one little basket. Tisket and tasket, your eggs are spilling out your basket beers. Sex and loves, especially in their delights, extends far beyond the mereness of the concerns of consent. One may even go so far as to say that consent as a concept may amount to consent within power imbalances, or even the very notion of consent as being saying yes to a power imbalance. That is, more than the likely true point, that power imbalances abound in the world, as all the pretty words written earlier display for young gentler readers. The utilization of power imbalances with the right intent are exactly what is meant by consent. In other words, to consent at all is to be propositioned in the first place, and the propositioning is predicated upon a power imbalance, more aptly phrased, an aesthetic that moves one to proposition and consent. The claim here being that in any case, from any perspective, the attraction, beauty's gracing gaze, from whatever aspect of the person creates the aesthetic and hence the power imbalance, that emotion the coward turns away from, to which they therefore either consent to or not. One does not consent without the proposition, removing that gentle pin. The boss's advance after all is that which makes the option of consent. To when and why do they move? Moreover, the lowly employee wants this too. At least, oft enough this is very, oh so very true. It is not the case, after all, that the lowly employee is actually helpless, nor is it the case that they didn't themselves ask or even approach. The trope of the boss's advance is just that, a trope. One that is intended to highlight a real problem for what it's worth. But in so highlighting that problem, the trope masks a lot of the reality of the situation. The boss may in fact be hot. One can get a sense of this too within some of the relevant feminist label, when it speaks to women using their sexuality to get what they want, to, let's be a bit crude here, to fuck for work and to fuck for advancement at the job. The unabashed utilization of feminine sexuality to allure in order to get what they want. Now, I want to temper that point. Such behavior is just as bad as the boss's behavior in the example. It amounts to an abuse of power. The powers in question differ, but the point they share in common is the utilization of a power imbalance towards ends that are, let's say ignoble. What is the bad, in other words, isn't that the use of power is coercive, and due to that coercion it is impossible to consent, and because it lacks consent it is rape, or sexual assault or sexual harassment. What is bad, what is abusive about the situation is that folks are using something honest, good, and wholesome, sex, sexuality, and love, and sublimating the will of the other person, especially via means other than the teleological aims of sex, sexuality, and love. It is the dishonesty of the situation. It is the boss who makes advances without honest intent of sex, sexuality, and love. Their status as boss is an alluring aspect. It allures people to them. We might hold that it's the transactional nature of the relationship, rather than the coerciveness. That is, that sex for that kind of interaction is the problem. There is another issue that isn't exactly related to the concern of consent, namely, does such favoritism make the workplace into a bad? Which it likely does. I don't think there is a whole lot to say on the matter. The only real plausible pushback I can think to give to it is that in at least some instances, workplace favoritism is valid. Think, small shop, mom and pop. They favor themselves and their kids. Big surprise. And mom or pop may be drawn from within the ranks of the poor lowly employees they have. That is, employee may end up fucking, dating, or marrying the boss, and hence become the favorite. And such may not really be a bad. I think this may depend a lot on the scale of the workplace. A small shop is one thing, a large business with hundreds or thousands of employees is a very different matter. See public-private distinctions in moneyless free labor societies. Here though we are speaking of the relationship between coercion and consent. I am reminded of some of the red pill content, whereby the dudes are going on and on about bettering themselves, getting that better paying job, working out, and so forth, all to attract a lover. We could go back and forth on the merits of this in pragmatics, but the point here is that clearly for a lot of dudes out there, the notion of being the boss, having the cash, having the good bod, and so forth are exactly as I am suggesting here, means to allure. They are a part of the song and dance of the species, the masculine aspect of it perhaps, but I'd suggest fairly innocent in its formal structure and intent. We may view such, in other words, as akin to the wearing of makeup, the putting on of fancy clothes. Such that when someone worries much about the boss's allure, are they not thereby simply saying, "You hussy?" This indeed worries me a great deal, as it looks, sounds, walks, and talks a lot like a sex-negative viewpoint. One that wants to cover up and hush up the alluring, or at the very least, put a gag in them. That is, they are doing it for the right kinds of reasons, for sex, sexuality and love. Not towards the ends of abuse of power. In the same sort of way that the ladies doll themselves up, work out, dress nicely, and so forth. They too can and do so for the wrong sort of reasons, that is, for reasons other than sex, sexuality and love, for reasons of manipulation and abuse. Each of these sexual displays create power imbalances of differing sorts, really aesthetical differences which amount to differences in power. Though, here I think there is a meaningful difference to be had. The allure of the body so described plays within the fields of sex and love more directly. It is a direct manipulation of the alluring bodies, it is putting oneself out there in the proper context, which is applicable for all sexes and genders. The boss is using something else, something other than their bodies and sex appeal. They are using money, the tacit threats and rewards available for them to offer. We could, in other words, admit that, alas, 'tis true, the manipulation of people towards the transaction of sex is the bad of note. A misplacing of the aesthetic from one of its teleological frivolities to something of a dire set of circumstances. The abuse of power towards the aims of bad faith acting in the realm of sexuality, in love's palaces. A juicy cock waggling in the face is the right sort of tool to use. It may be abused, but it doesn't thereby rob people of their capacity to consent. The abuse lay with the manipulation, the bad faith acting, the transactional nature of it, not the lacking of consent. Nonetheless, there is something oddly coercive and perhaps robbing of consent about the utilization of inappropriate tools of sexuality. This could get messy rather quickly though. Which tools are valid? Money? Wits? Poetics? Flowers? A gun to the head is not the right sort of tool to use. A flower to the head with a grin, perhaps that's fine. The tacit threat of work and the tacit rewards of work each constitute the wrong sort of tool. In the currents, where work to live is a reality, there is something strikingly similar involved with the tacit threat of woe or will in the workplace that the boss has on the offer. Noting that this concern may and likely does differ in a moneyless free labor society, so here let's answer both set of circumstances, moneyed and moneyless. This place seems as good as any to note the reality of the housekeeper in a moneyed society, trapped. While it is perhaps true that the worker bees go forth to make the honeyed monies we all partake in, nonetheless that it is required to live at all entails a problem for the housekeeper. This seems to be perhaps better getting at the point of the problem. I think firstly the credibility of the threat is important. The flower to the head with a grin is perhaps fine simply because the threat isn't credible. Similarly, the notion here is to what degree is the threat a real sort of thing? It is one thing to speak of the possibility of something, some perhaps unrealistic or extreme example. It is another thing to speak of something that happens all the time. One may get murdered walking the streets, but if the chances of that happening are vanishingly small, should we put a curfew out to prevent people from walking the streets? Should we make laws to protect against the circumstance and not the action? Murder is illegal, the action is against the law. The circumstances are, if you walk the streets you could get murdered. Therefore, make walking the streets illegal. Or, if not illegal, a cultural bad, something one ought not do, something you teach people that they ought not, but don't enforce the matter. Perhaps we bring forth the masses of police, heavily armed and ready to kill, that they might watch the streets. These only really make any sense if there is a real threat there. See the points later in this series regarding the data on sexual assault, sexual harassment, and rape stats. Here let me try to summarize the points made later. I simply do not trust any of the current data on the matter. That's going to be a difficult thing to rectify too, and I would note that similar issues are being faced by the sciences and academics across the board. This isn't something that is peculiar to this issue. I'd reiterate here that among the most serious of concerns on the matter is that there may be nothing more to many of the claims, and hence to much of the data on the issues, than a difference of cultural understanding as to what constitutes wooing. A very dangerous sort of thing whereby one culture looks upon another culture with claims of wrongness to the going-on stare. That the claims being leveled themselves are contested, and yet the data that is oft cited relies exactly upon those contested claims is a very serious problem. To be blunt, sexual harassment may be a real sort of thing, but how it is applied is highly contested. What is wooing? What is coercion? These are the very things under discussion here. To come at me with data predicated upon an understanding that, for instance, giving multiple flowers to someone constitutes sexual harassment, or a casual touch on the thigh is sexual assault, merely makes me deeply skeptical of the persons presenting such data as if it were definitive proof. Indeed, I find the claims being underpinned by such a profoundly sex-negative viewpoint that I am deeply skeptical of the persons making the claims as doing so in the good faiths of sex and love. In the absence of reliable data, we ought rely on such things as reason, logic, honesty, reasonableness, generosity of interpretations, and a disposition of kindness. Moreover, data isn't likely to resolve the issues of differing cultural perspectives. Such things are simply not so straightforwardly derived from the data. For all that, I'd again reiterate that there is a something to this concern. A gun to the head entails not being able to give consent. A slave, not in the BDSM sense, can't really give consent either, though see previous cautions on this point. And troublingly, moneyed societies are a lot like slavery with extra steps. The point in this instance is how oft is it the case that the boss utilizes their position to rob a person of their consent in sex, and hence commits rape, or sexual assault, or sexual harassment. Assuming that social stature is not a proper tool to use. Or, perhaps it is moneyed structures that are not the proper tool to use. There are fairly odd things in play here. Suppose that we aren't dealing with the boss, but rather, with someone that has more money than you. The threat that they might remove that money in the context of this society where money is required to live may have similar sorts of concerns. Does that threat being done with the wrong sort of tool to use entail a lack of consent due to its coercive power? The intuition seems to run differently, and perhaps because all persons involved are in similar sorts of circumstances, one just has more monies. Perhaps, too, there is something about the private ownership, that rights to make decisions that is in play. As in, we might tend to assume that the person with more monies has the right to take that cash stack away if they want. We might hold that such could be construed as poor behavior, but that they have a right to do it entails that there isn't anything of serious wrong with them doing so. Though of course, that may beg the question here. Do they have that right? If that is, suppose, play pretend with me a moment, that by doing so they are in point of fact committing rape, or at least sexual assault. They are using the wrong sort of tool, and hence much like the gun to the head, the coercion involved is no longer wooing because it robs them of their ability to consent. If that is the case, then there ought not be a right to remove the monies, as doing so would be tantamount to saying they have the right to rape. Here again we do well to bring up the real-world instances whereby the housekeeper doesn't have a means of honey-making in the society. Even in a world where they technically have the capacity to do so, as in, they certainly can go out and get the job and that jazz, their role as housekeeper significantly limits their capacity. They have, in other words, rather serious disadvantages. Simply removing the money can entail pretty extreme poverty, and indeed even effectively death without outside intervention. The point here being that there are real threats involved in having someone's withdrawal their honeyed monies, and hence there is a real plausibility that, for instance, folks fuck because they don't want to lose out on that cash. Not for reasons of greed either, but rather as a matter of simply living. Such may amount to lacking consent. Though I think even in these circumstances, we are speaking of iterative sexual violence, rather than specific instances of sexual violence, which can be quite a different sort of matter. Note that iterative sexual violence will be covered more fully later in this series. In the case of simple removal of money, or the passive threat of it, there isn't a clear indication that there is anything particularly bad going on. As in, there isn't any real action being taken by anyone involved whereby we could hold that there is a force being applied to even make it have the proper character of issues of consent and rape. In other words, while the circumstances may be bad, it isn't the case that anyone involved is necessarily doing anything bad. Such is often the case with these sorts of systemic issues, and perhaps too, with iterative sexual violence. Moneyed systems may be slavery with extra steps, but it isn't the case that anyone within it is necessarily doing anything bad simply by living within it. Note though that such can be a good reason to change those circumstances. They simply may not be instances of rape and lack of consent. If, however, the threat of the removal of monies were actively made, and perhaps even more pertinently to the point, repeatedly made as a means of control, that starts to look a lot like control and hence to rape. This is true regardless of what is threatened to be removed. The threats of removal of affection, sexuality, loves, time together, monies, housing, food, any of these kinds of things are bad to threaten with. And any of them can amount to coercion, force, and hence rape if done. At least, that is, by the logic of consent being examined here. Perhaps importantly note that disagreements about the circumstances doesn't necessarily entail someone's consciously choosing to use those circumstances towards the ends of control. It could, but the point is that there may and often are legitimate disagreements, and moreover disagreements made via ignorance. Still, the point trying to be made is that there is something plausibly different in regards to the workplace in that there is a fairly powerful intuition that there is exactly a right to work and a right to be treated fairly in the workplace, a right to be treated as a worker primarily, though perhaps not exclusively, in the workplace. We might, in other words, carve out exceptions to those rights, such as the mom and pop, really small businesses, and perhaps other things too. But the point is that in the workplace, unlike in the case of simply being more wealthy than one's lover, there is an expectation of treatment that entails that something is wrong with the boss simply firing you because you wouldn't sleep with them, or rewarding you for fucking them. Someone with the monies may use the threat of money as a means of control, and that may be a bad, but then, there isn't an expectation of a right to that person's money in the first place. That may vary some in different instances. For instance, marriage may exactly entail some rights to each other's monies, properties, affection, sex, love, time, etc. But as a matter of sexual ethics, perhaps the point is valid. To be clear here, insofar as this may go, which may be nowhere by the way, assuming that the use of the tool of money to coerce is in fact the wrong sort of tool to use and therefore would otherwise constitute rape, we could still hold that unless the person who is being coerced already has some rights to the fat stacks of cash, there isn't any rape involved. They are in a position of trying to get something themselves, namely that fat cash load blown all over them, and hence they cannot be getting raped because of it. Any claim towards the cashes that they ain't already got, in other words, already entails that they are consenting towards the sex. Perhaps with poor intent, but nonetheless it isn't rape, sexual assault, or sexual harassment. To be blunt to the point of the gun simply wasn't put to their head in this instance. They themselves were trying to get access to the gun. I want to try and answer the question directly here: is the abuse with the wrong sorts of tools towards sexual ends or at least a measure of rape? Is consent lost at least specifically when coercion is used via the wrong tools to woo someone? I want to say yes. In the case of the boss though, I want to say that the situation is more complex than the case of the gun, or the case of the non-BDSM slave. This because the potential victim folks are pointing to, the lowly employee, may actually willingly participate for the gains thereof. Consent in such instances is iffy at most. In other words, the power imbalance itself isn't sufficient cause for the event to be raped. There has to be other sorts of circumstances involved to make it so. Moreover, the boss can and often enough is in fact also a victim in these sorts of circumstances. Namely, they may be taken advantage of for their money or for their capacity to bestow rewards. We may not hold such as the same bad, it seems Susie AF, but perhaps it isn't rape. It is interesting because it is clearly a kind of sexual bad, and it is as if there isn't a word for it yet. Or, perhaps there is, and that word is simply this: rape. It is taking advantage of someone, it is using them in the wrong way sexually speaking. It is using the wrong tool to woo. It is, perhaps, making pretense of love, even pretense of sexual interest, conning someone out of their money. It is sexual con artistry, and it is quite terrible for a wide variety of reasons. But I wouldn't think of it as rape. I think the terminology at this point is unclear. There is an ethical bad going on, but perhaps placing all the sexual ethical bads into rape and rape-like categories is insufficient to the task of understanding them. It is its own peculiar sort of phenomenon, one that is quite rampant in the current via especially women towards men. It may constitute rape on iteration though. That is, not this or that man, not this or that instance, but the overall structure may constitute a rape machine, whereby men are tossed into it to be fucked and used at the whims of women. Here we are speaking of things that are broader sorts of concerns, similar to the boss being a part of a broader economic system whereby folks end up doing the sex, making the love, for all the wrong sorts of reasons. Whereby even though we would be hard-pressed to hold that this or that, perhaps much of any instances are rape, sexual assault, or sexual harassment, taken together as a whole, the culture itself may indeed be, a wee bit rapey. Perhaps, as was mentioned in the case of the boss who willfully manipulates, such may amount to rape, and similarly when the sexual con artist willfully manipulates, it amounts to rape. But in either case, simply existing or fucking in the context of the bad circumstances, neither is rape, neither may even be particularly bad for that matter. The circumstances are bad, not the sex or the love. I direct folks to again consider the case of the actual no-holds-barred slave as the extremity of this point. If it is true in the case of the slave that they can indeed have legit sexual desires, that they can legit experience love even towards their master, then it is certainly true in these far and away less extreme cases. Again, the concern in the case of the slave is that to deny that is to deny them their humanity even more than it already was, and the theoretical point of pertinence is that the problem is the bad circumstances, not the bad sex and love. Much as with other aspects mentioned in this piece and indeed this series, what may break the wave upon the ethics for willful manipulation may amount to how oft such is the case. I know in the current the things I am describing as happening to the menses is quite prevalent. Their being abused in such ways is actively celebrated. Folks ought hear concerns expressed for being used for one's money, walking wallets, etc., but also less so heard are such things as being treated as if a predator, not being sexualized, not being approached for sex and love, being treated as disposable, being treated as if a threat, being emotionally manipulated, being used as merely an instrument to one's life. I suspect that many folks are uncomfortable hearing those kinds of things, and imagine that the issues of the lowly employee are the issues of the lowly woman, because they are of course trained to think that way. I'd again though point towards the worker bees. The folks that go out and do much stuff, work the many hours, while others may very well not. The disposition of women in particular to ask for help and hence control others, or to cry, literally or figuratively, as if there were a harm, when in fact there is none, or the harm is unjustified emotional harm. Feeling bad for bad reasons, oft under the auspices of themselves being weak, vulnerable, etc., women's tears, badgering, complaints, pressuring men in particular, shaming them if they refuse. These are very real things that happen on the daily in men's lives. Women being emotional hogs. The utilization of sex as if they are doing their lovers a favor is a rather serious problem in the day-to-day lives of people. Rather than simply admitting that they themselves enjoy sex, enjoy fucking, and doing it for the sake of at least the fucking, if not for the sake of loves and sexualities more broadly. The former is such a dim sex-negative view it really is difficult to sympathize with the perps there. These are not unrelated phenomena to the questions of the boss. Partly because those actions in the workplace are not strictly segregable from the realities of sexual cultural practice writ large. That is, what may or may not be valid in the workplace also is such relative to the broader sexual cultural practices. If the reality in the culture writ large is quite literally women utilizing their sex towards the ends of obtaining other things from men in particular, we might find it to be not a big fat surprise if women are either apt to or even expected to do the same in the workplace. The workplace-non-workplace distinction, while valid, is merely one of imagination after all. I cannot stress this enough. This isn't to blame women, it is to point out the reality of the agency that women have in the dynamic, and the rather boring analysis of the expected sorts of outcomes. If women use their sex and sexuality writ large to take advantage of men, there is very little reason to suspect that the same kind of behavior wouldn't be permissible, expected or apt to be done in the workplace. We could, in other words, taboo it, but we would generally expect it to occur nonetheless. Moreover, we might seriously begin to question the validity of the claims being made within the workplace regarding sexual malfeasance. If it is the case that women are actively participating in this as agents, which they most definitely are doing, so to be clear, it becomes far less clear that there is the degree of coercion involved, such as to be robbing anyone of their agency. Partly because the lowly employee may be doing the same kinds of things and have actual relevant power that is worth considering. In other words, unlike in the instances of the actual non-BDSM slaves or having an actual gun to one's head, the situation is actually a power dynamic and not a one-way kind of thing. To reaffirm the points being made here, there is no disagreement as to if the boss can abuse their power and do a bad by doing so. There is disagreement and serious questions as to if such bads are because there is no consent, that is, because the capacity for consent is being robbed, or if the bads are for other kinds of reasons, such as workplace ethics, which are pretty nominally important tbh, or because of manipulative abuse of power, which are of more significance, or perhaps because it is the wrong sort of tool to use in sexual interactions, which may be fairly theoretically interesting. The main thing I am seeing here though is that there isn't a particularly good case to be made that the bad is because of incapacity to consent. Though I admit that such is possible, I do not see it as being off the case. Here, for instance, take the worst of cases. Something very transactional, a quid pro quo for a job, a position, something of that nature. No doubt that's bad. The question is, does the person saying yes to that have agency? And the answer appears to very much be yes. It is bad, but not due to lack of consent. What's more, and this is going to sting the feministas out there, in many, perhaps most cases, the women are actively, willfully, joyfully participating in the practice. It is celebrated in the culture writ large. This simply cannot be denied. You can drag folks over it, but it is literally sung about. Girls, girls, get the cash. If it's 9 to 5 or shaking you ass. Ain't no shame, ladies, do your thing. Just make sure you ahead of the game. Praised in pop culture, splattered all across the internets, the abject aim of manipulating and controlling men in particular in order to gain something from them. The notion that the bad was because of lack of consent is a way that folks are trying to absolve themselves of that responsibility. If they had no other choice in the matter, if that is just how things are done, then, alas, my poor ladies, they just being used, lack the capacity for consent, and thus they must be protected against the big bad menses out there. An important upshot in all of that is that perhaps the boss was a bad actor, but then, in most such cases, so too was the poor lowly employee. It was mutual, in other words, in most cases. Likewise, it would be foolish to think that the boss necessarily initiates. Again, it is actively celebrated in the culture that women will exactly initiate in those circumstances in order to obtain something from the boss. If not in making outright offers, in dressing for success winky face. In other words, in some cases it is the poor lowly employee who is the bad faith actor, and the boss who is the victim. All of these aspects of the reality are masked by folks who argue that it is just about consent. They incorrect in their analysis though. It is bad due to the aforementioned poor workplace ethics, abuse of power, perhaps the utilization of the wrong sorts of tools, perhaps because it aims at the wrong sort of thing, which is honestly my preferred sort of answer to this. That is, again, it is bad because it isn't sex for sex's sake, or sex for love's sake. It is sex done for the sake of money, promotions, jobs, etc. It has the wrong kind of teleological aim to it. I prefer this answer because it isn't particularly ambiguous. It doesn't depend upon measuring rather odd circumstances that are oft confused and relative, that is, power dynamics. It provides fairly clear answers to the concerns, and it provides the kind of answers we are expecting. That is, it isn't saying, contrary to the intuition, that those instances are actually fine. It is saying they are bad, and the reason they are bad is because of the poor aiming. Moreover, it doesn't misclassify all the likely many, perhaps majority, of instances where literally nothing is wrong with the relationship. Most of the time, that is, everyone is consenting, happy with the arrangement, no one did anything wrong. It was people who met, had different power structures in their life, and went for sex and love for the sake of sex and love. The consent modeling for why it is bad would have to hold that all those instances are actually bad, because they inherently lack consent. Indeed, they lack consent even if all participants disagree with the assessment. Even if everyone involved shouted, "Yes please, do this, fuck me," the consent modeling holds that they are wrong. They are confused about themselves. They are merely upholding the power structure. They are being raped and they don't even know it. Don't trust your eyes, don't trust your experiences, don't trust your own opinions on the matter, don't even trust your own feelings about it. Trust me. So says the consent culturalists.
Undresses Ann In.